pricing is a team sport. All of those different groups need to be part of the decision. So it's incumbent upon the product team to steward the rest of the organization through that decision-making process.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for in eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the proportional relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Ryan Glushkoff, and here are 3 things you want to know about Ryan before we start. He is the founder of Fraction 8, a pricing and product marketing consulting firm focusing on B2B software firms. He was our guest on episode 16. It took him 2 years to make it back on, but we won't hold that against him. And he just got his black belt in karate, so we're not holding anything against him. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be back again.
I just love talking to you about pricing, so it's fun. If anybody wants to know how you got into pricing or why you stay in pricing, they can learn that from episode 16, because I'm sure I asked you those questions a long time ago.
You did.
So let's just jump into some fun pricing topics. And you had sent me a few things that said, hey, here's some stuff that I'm interested in or we could talk about. So let's do it.
Let's do it. Jump in.
Let's start with the qualitative and quantitative stuff that you're doing on competitors and buyers.
Sure.
So how are you doing that? What are you actually doing? Well, I guess first what you should do is tell the audience what you do. And that way it'll make more sense when we say, okay, here's what you're working on and how you're doing it.
Of course. So I'm an independent pricing consultant, and I work with B2B technology companies of varying sizes. And usually I create a custom scope based on their needs to help them. And usually that's around helping them craft that one pager that you need to put in the hands of a quota carrying sales rep to say, hey, this is how we price everything that we do, whether it's products, services, hardware, any part of their portfolio. Although usually I focus on the software elements. Part of that work has some qualitative and some quantitative elements. Qualitatively, I spend a lot of time talking to people. I don't usually do focus groups because they fall victim to groupthink, but I usually focus on one-on-one conversations with buyers that are in the target addressable market to understand their motivations for coming into market, the value that they expect to receive out of a solution. And, I try and ask them quantitative questions as well to understand what their willingness to pay is for that solution. I feel like no buyer persona is really complete unless you have some numbers in there to address the pricing elements of what they're expecting.
Yeah, I think the qualitative stuff is so fascinating. I think we often underplay it, and then sometimes we overplay it, as in we're going to pretend like it's really the market. But we underplay it in that we don't do it enough. People want to jump to the survey and they don't go out and ask the questions. And so it's a yes or no question. I shouldn't ask it this way, but do you ever ask your clients, what do you think your customers are going to say when I ask them, what do they value? And then you go out and talk to customers and find out what they value.
I usually do that for both the qualitative interviews that I conduct, as well as the quantitative surveys. I'm an engineer by trade, way back when, although don't ask me to design a furnace or a heat exchanger anymore. I think those days have passed. But I always go into these conversations, I treat them like a science experiment. So it's just kind of the way I think. I always like to go in with some sort of hypothesis around what I think is going to happen. And usually that's informed partially by what the customer thinks they're going to hear. And I try and validate that or invalidate that from what I hear.
Okay, so now the hard question, how often is what the client said to you people value, what people actually tell you that they value?
I would say, I'd say half and half. There are definitely a lot of surprises, particularly with product features. I feel like there's, especially in software, I've seen a lot of product features which companies think, oh, this is the most valuable thing that our customers want. But when you actually talk to them about it or put it in a survey and measure, that feature's value or relative willingness to pay, it's often something that the customers don't value, or they think, yeah, it's just kind of a table stakes feature that should be included for everyone. And it's so there's a little bit of a aha moment for companies that I work with.
Yeah, and I think the aha moments, the surprises, that's where the fun is, right? That's actually where the value is to what you do, because you're bringing back information that the client didn't know, wasn't using, was incorrect in. So I think that's where most of the value is, or a lot of the value is that you're bringing.
And
What do you?
I'll just add one more thing.
Mhm.
When you discover those features that customers attach a lot of importance to, those are the features that can differentiate one plan versus another, or justify an increase in price for one segment versus another. So those are really kind of some of the most important data points that can be uncovered through these regular conversations with buyers, whether they're qualitative or quantitative.
Right. And so they should be driving a lot of your decisions, the segmentation, the packaging, maybe even the pricing metrics decisions that you're making. So very nice. What do you do in terms of collecting data on competitors? Because you mentioned that you do some on that, and I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So competitive research, I typically break down into three different types of research. One is strict capability research. So what features does one competitor have versus another? The second type is really sales competitive research, where you're trying to uncover, what are those tidbits that we need to arm the sales team with in order to win an opportunity against a specific competitor. So I think, a long time ago, you taught me from one of your classes, the weakness and strength approach, and I still use that to this day. And then the third type of research, which is where I spend probably most of my competitive research time, is understanding the offering structure of competitors specifically. So things like, what is their pricing metric? How many plans do they have? What do they charge? What plans do they offer? What's included in the plans? What's not included in the plans? What are the contract terms that they offer? And really kind of getting an understanding of, hey, what is the architecture of that offering structure look like? And usually when I do this for clients, I advise them that, hey, competitor research is look but don't touch. Competitive research is something that it's really good to know, but since every company has their own unique value prop that they bring to market, just copying a competitor, doesn't, you're probably leaving something on the table by doing that, or you're selling yourself short.
Yeah, first off, there's no odds are really good that competitor didn't know what they were doing when they put their pricing together. So copying them makes no sense whatsoever. But we do want to understand it in terms of, look, our buyers are making a choice between our competitors' products and our products. So we want to make sure that they make the right choice.
And that is an important point too. So even though you want to, be totally different than your competitors and really kind of set yourself apart, at the same time, when a buyer is considering, you versus the competitor, you have to make that comparison relatively easy for them. So for example, if all of your competitors are using per user pricing, but you've done the research that, hey, maybe we have a better option than per user pricing, maybe we should be charging based on storage space or video views. If everyone else is charging per user and you don't, that could have an adverse effect that you're not intending on your sales. So that's something to consider as well. This is kind of where pricing is part science, but it's also part art.
Yeah, part art. So what do you usually tell clients in that case? I've got my opinion, but I'd love to hear yours. Do you say, even though you know it's better per storage, we really ought to be going the same way our competition is because our buyers have to make decisions?
It's a conversation with the customer. I usually wait to have that conversation until I have the data in hand that backs up what I'm saying. Understanding that hey, the competitor, here's how the competitor's price, but also showing if I have data that shows, hey, I'm gonna a nice graph of willingness to pay on the y-axis with whatever that new potential value metric is on the bottom. If there's a really steep proportional relationship between those two variables that clearly shows, hey, different segments are willing to pay different prices, and we can build our packages around this, then that's a discussion. To me,
Yeah.
a conversation that is a lot of pros and cons to it. It's not as simple as just looking at the numbers and saying, yeah, we're going to shift our whole business around this. So
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
One of the things I usually think about and talk about when I'm talking to someone in these types of issues is, what if you did both? What if you offered both? Right? So think about buying a car. I could go buy a car, I could go lease a car, and even today I could subscribe to a car. Right? It's okay to have more than one pricing metric as long as you can make it make sense to your marketplace.
Yep, that's definitely an option. The only concern that I have with that kind of approach too is, some companies, you're spreading focus a little thinly across the organization and spreading scale, your ability to scale a little too thinly. So what you may gain in in terms of market size and really addressable market by offering different approaches, you may lose the benefits of scale. So it's a little bit of a you gain a little, but you may lose some as well.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs. As we complicate things, we confuse our own internal operations oftentimes.
Yeah. And I think one area you see that a lot actually now is some legacy software providers who are working to move to software as a service only. They still want to hang on to an old model of perpetual license, perhaps. And I think the economics are clear. SaaS is more lucrative, but how do you navigate that conversation with the company? It's not as easy as saying, hey, you should just move to SaaS.
Right. So one of the things that you'd said, let's talk about, is the pros and cons of user pricing. And have you done much research or looking into this thing called usage-based pricing? Because I've been a little confused or contrarian or something on this topic.
I've done a little bit of research on usage-based pricing. I've touched on it with a couple clients, not as much as I would like to, though. So I've actually, spent more time helping companies that have existing per user pricing and migrating to using a pricing metric other than per user. Per user is kind of the most common one. So.
And almost any other metric you move to feels to me like it's probably usage-based pricing.
It can be, yes, especially if you're, I'll go back to the example I gave before. If you determine that, customers are willing to pay more based on the number of, video views they use in your product. If you're Vimeo, for example, or YouTube, then that obviously, makes sense. And then I guess now that I think about it, you are correct. That is kind of a form of usage-based pricing.
Yeah. So it feels to me that as these people are talking about usage-based pricing, it feels like what they're really saying is pricing metric that's not users.
That's correct. Yeah. No, I think that's a fair description.
I guess there's one other pricing metric you could have, and we could call that outcome-based. So some people do outcome-based, but maybe that's a version of usage anyway.
Yeah, it's outcome-based it could be a version of user-based pricing. Outcome-based is even a little bit harder, I would say, because you're trying to accurately measure the value that they're getting out of a software solution. I almost think that's kind of the pièce de résistance of pricing, because you're completing the argument full circle. But that's a harder one. I'm not aware of any companies that have really truly figured that out yet.
Would you consider PayPal outcome-based? So the fact that you're going to take a percent of every piece of revenue that goes through, I personally would love to pay PayPal $1 million.
I think of PayPal, I don't think of that as, I think of more that as kind of toll booth pricing almost. You're passing a gateway and I'm giving you a little bit of a slice of, a very small slice of the pie, every time it passes through a specific gate. So I think of those as a little bit different. Those are pretty common where you see, companies taking a percentage of payments, and there's lots of companies that do that. They deal in
Yes.
hundreds of percents.
So the thing I like about PayPal or a company like that is they're at least saying, look, the more money you make, then I'm just going to take a little piece of it. So I want you to go make a ton of money. Or I think other people who are taking a piece, it doesn't feel like it's part of the revenue stream. It feels like they're just taking out of the revenue stream. So what do you think of companies like Uber and Lyft in that they're not really subscription-based companies, but they're certainly recurring revenue, and you would think of them almost like you would think of a subscription-based company? You're allowed to disagree with me. It's okay.
I don't think they're, I think they're, I don't think of them as a subscription based company. I think of them as a kind of a per use, more of a per use pricing structure. They're kind of in their own category to me. I almost don't even know how to describe them.
Okay, so let's continue down the gray area path. How about AWS?
AWS, I would put squarely in the usage-based pricing, because you're paying for access to a server. You're paying access for bandwidth. You're paying access for CPUs or memory cores or whatever have you. They have lots of options in the infrastructure as a service space. Same thing. I put AWS very similar to Azure for Microsoft or Google Cloud. So
now, how is that not identical to Uber? Oh man, I'm making you think. This is awesome.
in infrastructure, you can have in infrastructure, you could have, you typically, like when companies contract with an infrastructure provider, they're contracting for a specific rate structure that is predetermined in advance based on volumes. The same is not true with a company like Uber or Lyft, where it's more based on real-time supply and demand. There are this many cars available in my area, therefore the price is X. Whereas in AWS, there are horizontal tiers that says, hey, I'm going to use this much memory, I'm going to be charged this rate in advance. And I think I see those as different.
So the fact that we haven't pre-established the rate, essentially, the rate
That's
can
right.
change based on supply and demand for Uber and Lyft.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see that. I have to think through why I would think that matters, because what I love about thinking about all these is it helps me think through decisions that companies have to make. And when I think of Uber and I think of somebody who lives in New York City and takes Uber to work every single day, right? So this is a recurring revenue stream, and I want them to be happy, and I want to keep them as a client, and maybe I could grow them as a client and use them for other stuff. So I almost treat it just like I would a subscription, even though it's not a subscription. But then I can give you another example that I hate, and that is I used to drink Diet Coke. So is that just like recurring revenue, where I would go buy Diet Coke once a week, and so it just there's all these gray areas.
But when you buy Diet Coke, you go to the store and you are going to pay whatever rate it happens to be listed at in the store. And that's different from saying, hey, I'm going to pay for a weekly subscription to Coke, and I'm going to get, 12 cans for, $5 every week. And that's what I'm going to pay. So those are two different approaches, though, to feeding your habit.
Yeah, I think that if they had the subscriptions back then, I probably would have subscribed.
Your health is probably better for it now.
It is. Okay, so another topic you put on your list, which I thought is a fascinating one. Do we put our pricing online or not?
Right.
How do you think about that?
Ooh, tough one. I think, like any pricing decision, there are pros and cons. Personally, as a pricing consultant, I love it when customers put their price or companies put their pricing online because it makes it so much easier to do research. I think there are some reasons to put pricing online. First of all, price is just part of the buying decision. And if you as the vendor want to be part of that buying decision, you got to have the price online so the buyers have that input to the conversation.
Yeah. Well,
Plus, I think
and one thing that's interesting is price is always part of the buying decision, right? It's probably the only attribute that is always there.
so, and that kind of feeds into the second one too, is why would you cede that responsibility to a competitor or even your buyer's own assumptions? People make up stories in their heads all the time around, why someone else is doing something else. Might not be true, maybe true, but why would you cede that responsibility to someone else other than yourself? I just don't understand that.
My first assumption, if I don't see a price, is it's too expensive for me.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Yep.
I'm,
So
I'm,
that's an example. That's an example right there that you just created that narrative in your head. Might be true, might not be, but why did a vendor let you do that? They shouldn't. They should take active control of the conversation. And when a company takes active control of the conversation and you put your pricing online, they have the opportunity then to couple that pricing with other assets that help justify it. Maybe it's a peer evidence testimonial video, or maybe they're just going to be super aggressive and say, hey, we know you're, considering, this vendor, but we also know you're probably considering vendor B too. Let me show you how our pricing compares to vendor B. So you can do those kinds of things when you put the pricing online.
yeah. So can you justify why I would not want to put my pricing online?
I feel like in some cases, if you're running a business where you are selling through multiple different distribution channels, maybe you're selling through a VAR, but you also have your own internal sales teams, or you're selling into different verticals through different VARs, there can be conflict between those channels when you put pricing online. I've run into this firsthand, in the health benefits space, where you've got different brokers who have different relationships, and it can get messy when maybe the price that one broker is getting is different from the price that another broker is getting. I think another example of where it's not appropriate to put pricing online, sometimes certain solutions are very custom, and those customers expect kind of a customized VIP treatment of kind of scoping out that solution and giving you a custom price. If that's the buyer experience that you as a vendor want to deliver, then putting your pricing online doesn't really serve that purpose.
Yeah.
And it's better to not put it online.
So let me address both of those, if I may. First one is
Yep.
on the custom. I agree completely. That's the one that I think of a lot. Is it's too complicated. You're not going to be able to configure your own system. You really need someone to hold your hand to figure out what you need and how it's going to work. And in that case, what I usually recommend is put a price range in there. And I don't care if it's a huge range, right? It's somewhere between 100,000 and $1 million.
Mhm.
Right? But at least now someone can look at it and say, yeah, I'm probably closer to the top. I'm probably closer to the bottom. They can get a feel for the pricing, as opposed to, I have no idea what this is going to cost me.
So let me ask you this question. If
Mhm.
you have in software, software is not usually a commodity, just because every piece of software is just a little bit different from the other. When you have a product that is a commodity, what would you do with putting pricing online? Would that affect your decisioning?
So if it's a commodity, it's not custom. So therefore, I would absolutely have my pricing online. One of my favorite things, though, is I hate the idea that we even think of ourselves as a commodity. And I often use gold as my favorite example. Go to a couple different online gold vendors and buy a gold coin, and you're going to find they're different prices. So that's a commodity. Why in the world would they be charging different prices for the exact same thing? And it's whatever services they offer, however they captured you as a customer, the relationship they have with you. Have you bought from them before? There's a million different things that are going on there. And it isn't truly a commodity, even though it's a commodity. Right. So I would always, if it's a commodity, I'm putting my price online.
Okay. In general, I'd say if you had to ask which side of the fence I would come on or land on for, whether to put your pricing online or not, I would err on the side of putting it online. To me, the idea of maintaining positive control of the sales conversation is paramount, especially if you do your homework and you're confident in the research that you've done that informs the value of your solution, the price that people are willing to pay. If you've done that homework, putting the price online should not seem like a big lift.
Especially if you figured out how to communicate that value next to your price.
Mm-hmm.
So just throwing the price up sometimes is a little risky or questionable, but if you can communicate value, there's no reason not to.
That's right.
So, all right, what do we want to talk about next? I'm having a blast. Oh, I did want to bring up, you brought up channel pricing for why you may not, channel conflicts, for why you may not want to put your prices online. And what I often think of with that is that as the manufacturer or the supplier of the product, I think it's our responsibility to put up the list price, to put up the highest price we possibly are ever going to sell this at, and never charge something lower than any of my channel partners would ever charge. And so I feel like that's a responsibility. Now, I have seen circumstances where channel partners get upset because they know they could get more than what we put on our website. And in that case, I think what we ought to do is raise our prices so that the channel partner can get more.
I agree with everything you just said. And I was almost going to complete your sentence as you were saying it, in that if a channel partner wants to charge more, that's an indication that the company hasn't done their homework appropriately, that they've clearly missed some part of their pricing research.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we probably have time for one more topic. I'm having a blast though. Where do you think pricing should live in an organization? And by the way, what size organization do you typically work with? So what are we thinking of here?
I usually work with, I'd say, medium to larger organizations that typically have found product market fit for their product. They're funded and they're really just looking to scale their operations. Those are typically the kinds of companies that I'll do pricing work with, because their problem is more urgent, because they've typically got a team of sales reps that's clamoring for, hey, give me the price list because I want to start moving units for you. Now, typically where pricing lives in an organization, I think I've evolved over time on this, but part of that evolution, I think, is due to listening to your to you on your podcast over the years. But I think it really should live in the product organization. I've definitely worked with a lot of companies, in some of which it lives in marketing, some of which lives in finance. But I really think it should live in the product organization, because the product owner is really the CEO of the product. The product team has the deepest understanding of the problems that the buyer and the user are facing. They have the deepest understanding of how to go about solving those problems through the features and capabilities that the solution is offering. But that said, though, I would say the product management team typically lacks pricing expertise, which is a little bit of a, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I really think that's where it should live. I don't think it should live in marketing per se, although marketing does have probably the deepest understanding of the buyer and their motivations. I think finance obviously understands the economics of the company, but they don't truly understand value at their core. And sales, they're too invested in the buying process to know what works and what doesn't for the benefit of the company as a whole. So really kind of the best party is product. But that said, pricing is a team sport. All of those different groups need to be part of the decision. So it's incumbent upon the product team to steward the rest of the organization through that decision-making process.
I thought that was a great answer. Let me add a little nuance to my thinking on that. And that is, we could have a very tactical pricing. So who is it that's managing the price book and how often do we change it and how are we getting it out? And I'm totally okay with that being part of finance or sales ops or anything, because that isn't really setting the prices or negotiating the prices. That's really saying, look, let's just go do the execution of what we've already agreed to. And then there's the strategic side that says, okay, how do we actually put a price and how are we going to manage the price and how are we going to communicate the price? And there's so much going on. I think you're spot on in that the product manager would be the perfect place if they understood pricing. And that's the key problem is they know the value of the product better than anybody else. And yet they don't know pricing. So it's a fascinating problem. The solution I like in big companies that I see often is they have a pricing department, and I actually don't care where they report to. They act as an internal consultant that goes around and works with product managers, product marketers, sales teams, and they find the low-hanging fruit on how can we fix pricing issues going on inside the company. And I like that solution a lot.
That's a good point. Pricing is almost screaming for a center of excellence type approach like that, where there is an internal group of experts that's kind of loaned out on an ad hoc basis and an as needed basis to the various parts of the organization that need it the most. And it is hard to translate, that $100,000 worth of value that your solution may deliver in a given year. How do you translate that into that $20,000 deal size that you may get? How do you convert that $20,000 deal size into a pricing metric that can capture the various market segments? How do you know which features are monetizable and which ones are not?
Yep.
So I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and those are all hard questions, and I don't expect product managers to know. So I'm not making fun of them by saying they're not pricing experts at all. I'm just saying, look, those are all hard decisions that people like you and I have thought a lot about to try to figure out how do you learn this stuff? How do you figure it out? So nice. Ryan, we're going to have to wrap this up. This has been so much fun. Thank you for your time. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn is the best way. I think I'm the only Ryan Glushkoff on LinkedIn, so I'm pretty easy to find.
All right. And I'm sure we'll have your URL in our show notes. Episode 142 is all done. Oh, wait, I didn't ask the big question. Ryan, what's one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Ask your customers what they're willing to pay.
You don't really mean that. You don't really mean that.
I do mean that, but I want them to, but I'll give them a range, but I'll ask them what they're willing to pay in exchange for a value, for whatever value that I'm going to provide for them. But I feel like most companies, when they're doing individual interviews with customers, they don't ask that question enough.
So do you actually ask, what are you willing to pay?
I will, in qualitative conversations and one-on-one interviews, I'll have a pretty lengthy conversation about the value. I'll ask them to describe it qualitatively. I'll ask them to describe it quantitatively in terms of, which variables they use to describe the value. And then I'll follow it up with, now that their brain is swimming in the value, I'll ask them, okay, if you're willing, keeping that value in mind, what's an acceptable amount for you to pay for that value? What's a reasonable amount? And sometimes I'll even pull out, the Van Westendorp approach of asking them, okay, what's a price that you think is starting to get expensive? What price is just out of the question that you wouldn't consider it? What price is too cheap that you wouldn't consider it? And if a company is having enough conversations with their buyers on a regular basis, eventually you're going to get a pretty decent data set that's going to give you a pretty informed view of, what's a reasonable willingness to pay.
Okay, so I'm 100% with you on Van
Let me turn the The table on you. Why did you question? Why did you question that?
Okay, so I'm 100% with you on the Van Westendorp.
Mhm.
Anytime I've ever seen someone ask the question, how much would you pay? It feels like the person answering is trying to game the answer to the question. So if I give them a big number, then they're going to charge me a lot. So I should give them a little number. And so I made up a question that I love that acts exactly like that, but it isn't that question. And what I usually ask is, what do you think other people like you would be willing to pay for this? And it just takes a little bit of that gamesmanship out of their answer. And that's why I was reacting. It's like, no.
I understand that. That's a good point. It makes it less personal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
and they can be a little more truthful in their answer.
uh,
I may try that.
okay, good. Let
This
me
is
know
why I
how it
love
works.
this is why I love talking to you. I always learn something.
Oh, this is great. This is great. Okay, now I'm going to wrap the show. Episode 142 is all done. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.